Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of Ramadan in a New Country. This is a Lenten series for churches in the UCC to be able to live more deeply into their own spirituality while learning about the spirituality of those that we're serving through our immigration ministries, which at this time is predominantly Afghan folks and folks from other Middle Eastern or African countries. As I stated in the first part of this series, 70% of the world's refugees are currently Muslim. So this is an important topic, not only to understand the other that we seek to serve, but also to understand ourselves in relationship to the ministry that we're doing. As always, please, this is a Zoom meeting, and I would appreciate it if you're not speaking to keep your microphone muted. And I don't have any other housekeeping notes. So this week we are doing a comparison of Lent and Ramadan. And by comparison, I hold that word lightly because really this entire series has been intentional to make our own Lenten practices as Christians more deep and meaningful as we learn more about the upcoming similar fast of Ramadan that our new Muslim neighbors will be practicing beginning approximately April 2nd. In order to catch up to where we're at in this journey through understanding Ramadan, I can send you the first 2 links that were a part of the distribution email that I sent out. If you are not currently on that distribution list, you can go ahead and email me and I'll drop my email in the chat. The first week we talked about just a general introduction to Islam and Ramadan and why it's practiced, why it's important, and behavioral changes that will occur in the families that you're hosting. And then the second week, we talked about women in Islam because a lot of the questions that you all had revolved around understanding the gender relationships that you were seeing in the homes that you were sponsoring. And also we covered some of the stuff of Ramadan, for example, pots and pans or coffee, tea, or different ways of living that are unusual to us. And these can all be flexible if you do have questions about, again, behavioral changes that you're seeing in your families or things that you would like to understand more, even if they're not totally relevant to what we're talking about. This is the appropriate space to do so, and we welcome all any questions. So like I said, this week is going to be a deeper dive into the practice of Lent, which we are currently in the middle of on the Christian calendar, and how it relates to Ramadan and the practice of fasting or the practice of giving things up or being spiritually present with trying to change your behavior in order to become closer to God. So in order to facilitate more of that conversation, I've invited Reverend Mark Pettis, who is the manager for ecumenical and interfaith relations at UCC National. And Mark is going to talk to us more about Lent and its history, practice, and what it may or may not look like in the UCC. And then we'll dive into how that relates to Ramadan. So thank you for joining us, Mark. And I'm going to go ahead and hand the stage to you. And I will be monitoring the chat for questions and let you know if something comes up. Okay. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you. It is excellent to be with you all today. And I feel honored by the invitation. So a little bit about me. I came into this position with the national setting just a little over a year ago. And prior to that, I was serving as a local church minister in California. And so much of my understanding and approach to the idea of the season of Lent is informed by that service in a local church and how a local church in the United Church of Christ observed the season of Lent as liturgical season. You know, in the United Church of Christ, to say how is the season of Lent observed in the United Church of Christ is pretty much similar to saying how any one thing is done in the United Church of Christ, which is in many different ways at many different levels, and even within local United Church of Christ congregations, people's engagement with something like the season of Lent is going to vary, and we recognize that as one of the strengths of our faith tradition is the ability to engage in different ways, in the different various times of the year, in the liturgical year. But for the season of Lent, I think one of the realities is, um, it has not always been perhaps the most popular season for a lot of churches, because we contrast it very much. You think about liturgical colors in the season of Lent. The liturgical color is purple, and similarly in Advent, the liturgical color is traditionally purple. And those two seasons have very different feels, as we know. With Advent being kind of this um, progressive build-up and excitement to the celebration of Christmas, whereas Lent, while it does culminate in a lot of ways with Easter in our minds, it's not really a build-up of excitement so much as a time of intentionality for us. As is my style, I'm not going to be incredibly formal in my presentation, but I do want to share with you, I did put together a brief PowerPoint, and so I want to share that with you as a way of kind of walking through the uh, the topic. So we'll let this make its move to project. See if I can get that going. So the season of Lent is traditionally considered a time of preparation in the church, a time of preparation for Holy Week and Easter. I would say there are probably really significant differences in how different denominations will observe Lent. There's a far greater level of formality, I would say, in the Roman Catholic tradition than perhaps in our tradition, for reasons we'll talk about a little bit later. But I want to just name that on the front end. So when we talk about what is the season of Lent, and so I got just a couple of different descriptions of what Lent is. Lent's a 40-day season of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving that begins on Ash Wednesday and ends at sundown on Holy Thursday. It's a period of preparation to celebrate the Lord's resurrection at Easter. During Lent, we seek the Lord in prayer by reading sacred scripture. We serve by giving alms, and we practice self-control through fasting. We are called not only to abstain from luxuries during Lent, but to a true inner conversion of heart as we seek to follow Christ's will more faithfully. We recall the waters of baptism in which we were also baptized into Christ's death, died into sin and evil, and began new life in Christ. This is the definition of Lent coming from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, so the highest Catholic organization in the United States. To contrast that, and you will note a couple of things I would say, 40-day season of prayer beginning on Ash Wednesday and ending at sundown on Holy Thursday. That is something to take note, that is how the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops define the time period. Coming from the United Methodist Church, as an example, Lent is a time of repentance, fasting, and preparation for the coming of Easter. It is a time of self-examination and reflection. In the early church, Lent began as a period of fasting and preparation for baptism by new converts, and then became a time of penance for all Christians. Today, Christians focused on relationship with God, growing as disciples and extending ourselves, often choosing to give up something or to volunteer to give of ourselves for others. That is from the United Methodist Church, a slightly different approach, different understanding. And we just note that that's one of the wonderful things about living in a multi-denominational culture in the Christian world, is that different denominations will understand traditions in different ways and engage them in different ways. So just to give the example of some different views of it, a very brief history of Lent is there were early, and when I say early, I mean from the very early church with the the apostles who led the early church up through around 200 of the Common Era. There were early unofficial practices around a 40-day period prior to Easter. The apostles, for instance, had made suggestions that people needed to, people in the early church needed to take this intentional time to prepare themselves for the recognition of Easter. That those unofficial practices were formalized at the Council of Nicaea in 325 of the Common Era, and the Council of Nicaea is a key point in the history of Christianity, for it comes after it comes after Constantine, and it comes after the point at which the Christian religion kind of became a more accepted and widely practiced and acknowledged religion of the empire, which then allowed for more formal pronouncements and such. So it was formalized then, and it involved at that time. It was intended to be, and we all know this, it is the 40 days are modeled after, we know the number 40 in our scripture has significance. 40 years of wandering for the people of Israel in the wilderness, and more specifically connected to the Lenten practice, 40 days of Jesus going out and being in the wilderness prior to returning for his baptism. So, and the idea, when we read that story in the Gospels, we are reminded, that the idea that Jesus went and fasted for those 40 days. So in the early practices, the idea was there would be much more strict fasting as a practice during the season of Lent. And over time, those, more, the strict rules were eased over time. And as schisms occurred in the Christian church, when we speak about the Protestant Reformation and other schisms, the different practices for the Lenten season were adapted. And the rationale for the difference in practices in some cases, and we just know this, that some of them were, we're not going to do this because the Catholic Church does this. We're different, we're going to do things differently. In some ways that drove the decisions. In other times, societal priorities that we know that the wider culture has a way of impacting the way we practice our faith. And though in several cases that happened. And so as we think about some of the easing of the rules, I think that reflects in some ways the impact of the wider society and the rest of our lives on our practice of faith. So we saw that happening. So when we think about a more strict, like 40 days of fasting versus today, when within the UCC, that is not a common practice. We see how there's movement from one to the other over time. And just a few notes on Lent. I mentioned that the liturgical color is purple, and that color signifies it's used to signify penance and hope. It's a color for periods of preparation, and that's why we also have it as the color for Advent. Sundays in Lent there's some it's a small piece, right? When we talk about Sunday, we talk about Sundays in Lent. Sundays are not of Lent, and it's obviously a 1-2-letter word difference, right? But it's significant because Sundays in the traditional understanding of Sundays in the Christian tradition, Sundays are all intended to be a little Easter. We celebrate Christ's resurrection every Sunday in a little, at least a little bit, and Easter, of course, is the big Sunday when we do that. But because of that, Sundays are not part of Lent, and they're not intended to be part of our Lenten practices. And it also helps it helps with the math if we remove the Sundays, because Ash Wednesday to Holy Saturday is a 46-day period. And if Lent is a 40-day season, then we have these 6 Sundays that we remove out, and that then makes the math work for 40 days. So there are theological and there are practical reasons for this. And of course, the more important being the theological reason. I will tell a little story about the Sundays in Lent piece. I had a congregation I served in Northwest Minnesota. We, you know, in the congregations I have served, and it may be different in other places, we offered the idea, maybe invited people to think about engaging in a Lenten practice, perhaps giving something up, perhaps taking something new on. And some people did, and some people did not. I had a gentleman in the choir in this church in Minnesota who one Thursday evening, I was there when they were having choir practice, and he said, I had a question about this, Mark. This thing about Sunday. If you gave up, say, for instance, if you gave up beer for Lent, when does Sunday start officially? It's a very serious question he asked. He said, now, we know a lot of things in the Jewish tradition, things start at sundown the day before. So would that mean that officially the day starts at sundown on Saturday? Or does the day start at midnight? Or is it when I wake up? Or, these kinds of things. And my response to him, in my understanding of how we were engaging the practice and how it worked, was that we weren't particularly legalistic about this, and that the idea was that he had made a decision to take on this spiritual practice of not drinking beer during Lent, and that if there was a day that he was going to take off, that he could define for himself what the parameters of that day were, and that those decisions were between him and God. And I did not have a great answer for that, as is often the case. But this practice of giving up something is not necessarily universally embraced across Christianity. And what we've seen in somewhat recent decades, probably in the 1980s and 90s, when you have a prosperity gospel, for instance, rising in popularity and in prominence, the idea of giving something up seems to conflict directly with the theology behind that. And so there are absolute branches of the Christian church that would not suggest giving something up, I would imagine. And for others, it's a challenging question, the idea of giving something up, because the idea behind giving something up is that you are doing something intentional, giving something up that you frequently partake of or engage in, so that when you are not partaking or engaging, you are conscious of the fact that you are not doing it, and it makes you think about why. And so it kind of points us back to the whole purpose of Lent, which is to spend more time reflecting on relationship with God, reflecting on relationship with Christ, and taking that time of reflection. And so it needs to be something that is significant and noticeable, but at the same time, in our tradition, it is not something that we are legalistic about. We are not, I do not personally know of churches within the United Church of Christ who strongly encourage giving something up. It's kind of an invitation, because it falls into a personal practices thing. There's also been one thing we've noted in recent years. I am certain many, if not all of you, have heard about this conversation around being spiritual but not religious, and concerns about the institutional church losing its spirituality, and as a result, what we've seen is in some of the younger generations, there's been a real resurgence of observance of spiritual practices. I can say that in the congregations I've served, that some of our younger families in particular have been very interested in worship services that focused around spiritual practices, or seasonal work around those practices. And so because of that, the idea of the engagement with a Lenten discipline has seen a resurgence of sorts. I think you may have also seen perhaps more folks who were from the Protestant traditions, for instance, walking around with ashes on their head on Ash Wednesday, or in particular in the evenings, because our Ash Wednesday services tend to be in the night. More people engaging in those practices. We've seen that, and so how that works is on the rise. Let's see, I will stop my share at that point because that's my entire very long presentation. But I think, one of the things that, when I think about the United Church of Christ in relationship to Lent, and kind of as I think about in relationship to Ramadan, the existence of a position like mine in the United Church of Christ, an ecumenical and interfaith focused position, is an inherent affirmation of the faith traditions of others. And it speaks to how we value the idea of God being found, and people connecting with God through different faith traditions, and how we want to affirm that, we want to support that, we want to be in conversation with that. The best way, I think, for us to really engage in those kinds of interfaith conversations is by first spending time understanding our own faith and being very rooted in our faith, in our Christian faith. So I really appreciate the idea of saying, okay, we're going to talk about exploring Ramadan for those families who may come and be with us. But we do so really rooted in understanding what of our Christian faith motivates that, and undergirds that importance. In particular, and we think about it with Lent, it is a time to be self-reflective. It is a time to specifically take time to explore our relationship with God, to explore our faith, to deepen that faith through intentionality. And whether we look at kind of the historical models where it was very strictly prescribed what that meant in terms of fasting and almsgiving and things like that, or understanding that in a more current context of how does that translate to how we live out our faith, in terms of choosing to a discipline. Self-denial is not really something we talk a lot about in the United Church of Christ in our faith tradition, but being disciplined is something that we, I believe, try to uphold and encourage, and placing that focus on our relationship and how our relationship with God and Christ motivates us to engage the world. We talk a lot about a just world for all, and what is it that motivates us to seek that out? And so my hope is that in a season of Lent, when we engage in the spiritual practices, when we take the time to reflect on not partaking of this thing or that thing, or engaging in this, or if we took something new on, a practice of devotionals, a practice of evening prayers, a practice, whatever like that, but knowing why we're doing it, taking the time to think about, this is the rationale, this is the impetus for why I'm taking this on or why I'm doing this, and connecting it to that sense of self-reflection. And I think that just deepens the experience and helps us, in a very real way to be more, to better reflect the faith that we claim. I don't like to say the idea of being better Christians. I mean, I think it is in some ways, but it's to more fully reflect the faith we claim as Christians in this world today, and in particular in conversation with and as we work with people of other faith traditions and as we welcome them. So I am happy to have conversation, answer questions, and And I'm just really happy to be with you all in this time.
Thank you, Mark. And I totally agree. That's exactly why I framed this series this way as a practice of faith. And that's why we're having this session now, is to better understand our faith and why we're doing what we're doing in relationship with the families that we're working with. So I appreciate you coming and sharing your presentation to get us oriented to what it means for us. I also have a couple slides to bounce off of that are more about Ramadan, and then we can get into discussion and questions. So let me go ahead and pull that up. Oh dear, where is it? Okay. Okay. So I just, as we just did an overview of Lent, I'm not going to go all the way back through that again, but I'm basically going to be comparing Lent and Ramadan and Advent. And Mark also touched on that too, is the sort of hope theme, the purple theme of hope and penance that run through all three of these. Let me go ahead and bring that to full screen so it's less confusing to look at. So the idea of Lent is this idea of going into the wilderness that comes from Luke chapter 4, where Jesus is being tempted in the desert for 40 days. Satan is present and trying to tempt him with power and food, and Jesus holds his fast and prevails, right? And we kind of get the impression of Lent as being kind of sad, dark, lonely, because that sounds real lonely, hanging out in a desert with Satan for 40 days, I would think. I think that this is also why this sort of Protestant leaning that we see in a lot of churches towards being more about prosperity doesn't really like it, because Lent is kind of dark and scary, and it reminisces back to pre-Reformation times of when the Catholic Church was perceived as being real guilt-ridden and using methodologies to get people to feel bad about themselves so that they could use them to get more money for the church, right? This was a lot of the argument of the Protestant Revolution, which Protestants tended to not agree with anymore. And of course, Lent culminates in death, abandonment, betrayal. Holy Saturday, or rather, Good Friday and Maundy Thursday are not real fun events that involved nice, joyful things. So Lent is kind of a sad practice of being present with those dark things in your life, which I personally don't think is a bad thing. I think being able to self-reflect on, what has gone wrong, what is difficult in our lives in order to find that Easter Sunday is actually really vitally important. That's a lot. I'm a huge fan of Alcoholics Anonymous as a spiritual practice, and that's a lot of what they do in our church basements, right? Is understanding the darkness of their journey so that they can find that Easter Sunday. They practice Lent every time they go down there. But that's sort of the idea behind Lent, is Satan's present, trying to tempt us, and we have to go through a dark, scary, lonely path in order that will involve some unfun things in order to find that Easter Sunday. In comparison with Ramadan, which is also a fasting practice, Satan is absent. And what I mean by that is that it's believed that when that crescent moon that you see over here that I explained in the first week occurs on the first day of Ramadan, that expels Satan from the world, and he no longer has any power over what human beings do. And it's a time of freedom and renewal for humankind to fight against Satan. So it's the opposite, in which Satan's not there at all. And Ramadan, kind of the feel of Ramadan is really more about magic and mystery, empowerment, togetherness. The way that Ramadan is practiced is, like I said the first week, the whole community is doing it together. Can you imagine at the exact same second, every single person has a date and a glass of water and gets down to pray in the entire time zone? And then that happens every day. It's mind-boggling. And so it's a really empowering practice for them. It is not lonely. everyone's very specifically doing it together. Um, so it's also a fast, but it kind of doesn't act in the same way at all that Lent does, in which you intentionally go into a dark place. It's a fast in order to well, I don't actually know what language to use to describe the difference in fast. You are doing, like Mark said, you are practicing a discipline, but the sort of framework of the discipline is more like we are all doing this together in order to keep Satan expelled from the world, rather than I am personally going through this narrative of change and brokenness to find Easter Sunday. Um, and again, there are similarities, but the feel to it is quite different. And then, of course, Eid, which is the last day of Ramadan, is the culmination of wisdom and prosperity. It's believed that that's the replication of the day that the Quran was revealed to humankind, and it's a celebration. Of course, Easter is a celebration too, but not without the death and abandonment and betrayal that comes on Good Friday. And as I mentioned in week one, Muslims don't believe that Jesus died. They believe that he was replaced by a surrogate on the cross. They don't believe that any of the prophets died, that they were all eased their way into heaven by ascension rather than death, for the good works that they did. This death framework, dying to oneself, having God die for us, is definitely not part of any practice of Islam. That is unique to Christianity. And it's one of the reasons I love Christianity, honestly. I remain a Christian for this reason, is this idea of dying to things that don't serve us and then becoming new is amazing to me. It's the full culture of my life personally. So I would argue that actually Ramadan is more like Advent than it is like Lent. I also forgot to mention, in Ramadan, the angel Gabriel is the one that came down to Muhammad. I think this was mentioned in one of the videos we watched. Came down to Muhammad and said, "You're going to write this book now." He said, "I don't know how to write." And he said, "Well, now you do." Gabriel is also in the Christmas story, right? In that he also comes to Mary and says, "You're going to get pregnant." "Well, I haven't laid with a man." "Well, you're going to do it anyway," right? It's more similar in that way. And it's, again, the sort, like, we get this feeling during Advent of hope, empowerment, magic, togetherness. It feels more like Ramadan, Advent does. And while we don't normally fast during Advent, this idea of anticipation is still there. And again, culminates in wisdom and prosperity. Christmas morning is the day that God came into the world, very similar to the end of Ramadan when the Quran was revealed to the world. So I actually think that Advent and Ramadan have a more in common than Lent, and that Lent, as this sort of willingness to enter brokenness, I think that's unique to Christianity, and I find it personally really valuable. But of course, as Mark explained, across the scope of Christianity, there are lots of opinions about the utility of Lent. So commonalities across all three is it is a time of anticipation, renewal, increased spiritual and introspective behavior, and restriction of worldly habits, and increased awareness of angels and demons. As I said, Satan's in there, so is Gabriel. There is a spiritual realm at play when we intentionally invite God into the world in order to culminate into these big things. So all three of these seasons are considered to be a time in which the spiritual is closer to us on earth than in ordinary time. So things to keep in mind when it comes to your families that you are sponsoring is that you're both going through a spiritual journey, right? If you decide that Lent is something that you find valuable to practice and that it is a central part of your faith, then be present with that. And if you decide that Lent is not a central part of your practice and your faith, be present to how I would recommend being present to how Advent feels to you, because the way Advent feels to you as a Christian is probably how Ramadan feels to them. And as I've mentioned before, it is okay not to understand everything that you see and all the behaviors that occur, that it is going to be different and people do believe differently. And that sort of the beautiful thing about welcoming a different culture is being willing to learn and grow and enter into a place of somewhat discomfort while you're learning and growing, which, as I said, I think is also a practice of Lent, is the willingness to grow into discomfort. Um, and then I know that some of the concerns were about abusive behavior versus cultural nuance. You know, if you walk into a home and you see that the men and women are not in the same room, you're not allowed to talk to the woman. Is that cultural or is it abuse? In that particular instance I gave you, I would argue it's probably just cultural. Um, but if you enter into your own discernment, as Mark said, if you can grow strong spiritually about who you are in that present moment, it becomes easier to see the other more clearly. When you understand yourself, you're better able to understand what you see around you. So I would encourage integrating into your Lenten practice or whatever your practice may be during this period, your ability to discern and pray and be present with understanding the difference between abusive behavior and cultural nuance. There is no correct way to do that. It's just again being present with yourself and um, being present with God while you navigate what that is. You know, an example of abuse instead of culture, maybe if she shows up with bruises on her face, or she seems unable to speak with you even though you're a woman. That would be a red flag to me, is if a woman wouldn't talk to me as a woman. As I said, in that culture, women can definitely talk together, men can definitely talk together. But if she seems scared, that may be a place to explore. I can also cover that in more depth at another time if there's more questions about understanding the difference between abusive behavior and cultural nuance. And then be willing to make mistakes and learn from them. As I mentioned a few times, discomfort is okay, growing is okay, and we're all doing it together when we invite the spiritual into our space with intentionality, like we do in Lent, Ramadan, and Advent. So that's it in terms of presentations. Our final week next week is going to be Let's Talk About Race, and we'll talk about racism in the refugee resettlement system in the context of the fact that 70% of refugees worldwide are Muslim, and what that means for them experiencing the refugee resettlement system in terms of being the cultural other when they walk into a Western culture, as ours is. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out and open it up for questions for either Mark or myself, or if you have questions that have nothing to do with our presentations and are just about the families that you're hosting and you want more cultural information, like I said, this is an appropriate space to do that, and that's fine too.
Irene, if I may, I have the congregation I served in Manhattan Beach, we had a kind of a ongoing relationship with a Muslim group in the area. And part of it started off as this is a group, they were Turkish, most of them were from Turkey. And they had experienced, because of a lot of what their families were going through back in Turkey, this organization had decided to give up they had a space that they were renting, and they decided to give that up so that more of their money could be diverted back to support folks back in Turkey. So they were looking for space, and we made space available, and they invited us over a few year period to participate in an iftar with them once during Ramadan each year. And it was such an interesting experience because what was quickly learned was that we were not there to simply learn from. You know, it wasn't the families that gathered for the meal with the families from our congregation were not there just to. It wasn't a show. It wasn't a, they didn't want to simply be the recipients of question after question after question. What we learned was this was the invitation was to a conversation, because when the conversations were allowed to happen, what we received as many questions as we asked, and it was really a much more enriching experience when people understood that was the purpose, was to come into a cultural conversation together over this celebratory dinner at the end of a day. And it was a really cool experience for our folks. It actually was something that one of the things we know about our church is it's really hard to figure out what's going to be a really good event for people of various generations, various ages. And this turned out to be one of the best, across the board, from young children to our older members wanted to be there because it was an experience for everyone, and being able to share and be able to learn together was just amazing. And it kind of reflects kind of how we seek to engage people of other faiths. It's not, we don't do it. We recognize that oftentimes we are the dominant culture tends for us in a lot of the spaces where we are is the Christian culture, but to go in it with a sense of mutuality, to learn and to share, to be in dialogue, just is a more effective means. And it was just a great experience for our congregation.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for pointing that out. I think that's true as well. As most folks I know from other cultures don't want to be put on the spot with a bunch of questions about why are you acting like that. They want to be in a relationship with you, rather than be something that they have to explain. No one wants to have to explain themselves, but yeah, I would say I had a similar experience. The refugee office that I worked for in Seattle was in the basement of an Episcopal church. And the Episcopalians, well, not the Episcopalians in general. I like Episcopalians. I worked for Episcopalians for a long time. But the church people didn't always understand what was happening in the basement because folks were outside smoking all day and cooking food that made a lot of smoke and stuff, using things that weren't stoves. And it was confusing to them. And so I invited them to come to an iftar dinner, and we all had an iftar dinner together in the basement. And it was just as you described, where it was relational, and everyone got to learn from each other and share this nice meal. And we continued that tradition for that reason. Is relationship always makes otherness less other, especially when you enter into it in order to have that kinship rather than dissection. Yeah, Melva.
A few years ago, with the New York State Women's 3-day retreat, one of the days that we planned was a program on a Friday where we will have a conversation with Islamic women. Of course, it was a problem of day. It was a Friday. And so we had to really arrange everything with the imam. And he was very accommodating. They sent us about 10 women, I would say maybe about 9. And all of them are professional, from doctor to nurse to engineer, biochemist. And they were of different ranges of age, maybe up to about 55. And the question we had was, how does it feel to be a Muslim woman in a Muslim society, and how we as Christian women could relate to it? It was a very interesting topic because they have presentation wherein they made it so sure that there's really nothing different among us except our faith. And then they explain their faith. And then one of the things that really we try to accommodate them is, because it's about lunchtime, I reached for people who could provide halal food. They were so nice to say, no, you don't have to go all the way about that, because we could eat the salad. And some of them brought their own meals. They even brought 2 children, playing around because the mother could not leave them. But to be able to communicate, sit down and talk to them, there were about 100 Christian women in the room, and all of them were relating to each other. And then we learned that one of the women, the guest, was going to be married soon. And so the topic of wedding preparation came about. And everybody said, it's just like what we do. We do that. This is how we do it. And so it became so closely discussed discussion group, that if you take out all the things surrounding our faith, we're all the same people wanting to be able to serve God, wanting to be in fellowship with one another, and wanting to respect our own faith practices and belief. It was really a wonderful experience for us. And the fact that they accommodated our time. It's supposed to be, they should be in prayers on Friday, but they said being with us at that moment is also like praying. So that was really something that remained in my head. You know, it was a great experience.
Thank you. That's really important and powerful story that you shared, Melva. And I think, this conversation. Well, we have weddings too. People are people are people. We have weddings here. They have weddings there. We have kids here. They have kids there. There's a thousand ways that we connect our humanity that are universal, that aren't just the nuances of our culture and our religion. I think that's important. Thank you.
So if I may again, for fun, one thing that I, given my role with the national setting, in particular the interfaith piece of my role, one of the things that this is something I try to share in whatever setting I go into, because of where I come from in the church for us. First, I want to just really express my appreciation for those of you who've signed into this to learn. I mean, it's so important. It demonstrates, when we talk about in the United Church of Christ, we have wonderful phrases we like to use, like extravagant welcome and radical hospitality and things like that. And the willingness to learn and understand demonstrates a commitment to those kinds of ideals, because so often what we can recognize is, we also talk a lot about privilege in the United Church of Christ these days. And what we recognize is that there is a high level of Christian privilege in many of the spaces where we find ourselves, perhaps in our homes, perhaps in our churches, perhaps in our culture in general. And it's really important to recognize that privilege, because often when we're working, what I've experienced and what I see when we're working with individuals of other faith traditions, they often will offer to make adjustments or to work with us, because in so many settings, we are the dominant culture, in terms of religious culture. And one of the phrases that we hear in the United Church of Christ a lot, that I think, for me, is a driving concept for interfaith relations, is the idea of meeting people where they are. We so frequently believe that we accomplish that by welcoming people into our space and inviting them to participate in our things. But meeting people where they are means being willing to be uncomfortable ourselves, to go to where people are, to participate in what others are doing, without looking for accommodations for what we want or what we do. And it's a very different approach to how we engage in a world where, especially in our communities, where we can often again be the dominant culture in terms of faith traditions. So being willing to say, how can I make myself uncomfortable so that I'm meeting you where you are, and be willing to do that. I mean, in an ideal world, no one's uncomfortable, but we don't live in an ideal world like that. I mean, oftentimes the values are maybe in conflict. And so how do we really demonstrate that sense of radical hospitality by truly meeting people where they are? And so I want to applaud those of you who are taking the time to learn more, because that's a huge first step toward really living into these ideals that we so proudly claim.
So I know that folks tend to watch the recording later and then email me the questions. And one question I got from last week's that I wanted to clarify, by the way, is I had one individual ask, should you not shake hands cross gender or eye contact or acknowledge the person of a different gender is in the room? And I would err on the side of no, don't do that. I realized that I hadn't mentioned that in previous discussions. And as I did mention in previous iterations of this session, they're going to understand that we're a different culture and that we're not going to act exactly like them. But in traditional Islamic culture, men only make direct eye contact and speak to men, and women only make direct eye contact, speak, and have physical touch with women. And of course, as we've been mentioning, people are people, and people are on all sorts of a spectrum of how they act and live. And so my recommendation is to err on the side of conservative, and that if you are female, to interact with the woman, and if you are a man, to interact with a man, unless you are providing a service. So this rule doesn't apply if you are having a transaction. So for example, if you're a woman, you're going to a male doctor, or you're a woman and you're talking to your child's male teacher, that's totally okay to make eye contact, not touch, but make eye contact and have a conversation. But socially, a conservative Islamic culture would not do cross-gender conversation. So I would err on the side of social conservatism. And if they invite you to have a cross-gender conversation, if they initiate it, that's totally fine. But socially, that would be my recommendation. I thought it was a good question, so I thought I'd bring it up with you here. Okay, any last questions before we break for the day and then come back next week for our final installment?
I just want to thank you so much for offering these classes. It's really helping a lot, and I feel it's so important to look at the commonalities between religions rather than focusing on the differences in the beliefs and the cultures. So thank you again.
Thank you, Lori. I'm glad that this has come in useful. And again, if any questions do come up later, both Mark and I are available by email. Yeah, Melba.
Last thought, I just would like to remind everybody, or maybe you could also look it up. One church, there is a construction going on right now in Berlin of a house of worship, and it's called House of One. And it is a place where the Muslims, the Jewish, and the Christian religions are going to be in one building. So they have their own space, but they also worship together. And that is the idea of House of One. Please look it up. They broke ground already about a year or two ago. So it is under construction, and it took a long time for this to be approved because of the different religious group that are actually involved with this. But just the fact that it is already under construction gives us a chance to see and understand what we are doing. This is, of course, in Berlin.
That sounds beautiful. Thank you for the invitation to learn more about that.
I have 24 people from Berlin clergy coming in April 23 up to May 1st. And they would be in New York for 1 week with different programs. And I have set them up already. So I'd say it would be fun to have them because all of them are from different denominations, including one Catholic priest.
There's also a couple, I will just point out a couple examples. In Omaha, Nebraska, we have the Tri-Faith Initiative, which is Countryside UCC, along with a synagogue and a mosque that share space. They actually have 3 buildings on one plot of land, and they do a lot of mutual worship and activity together. And the other is there's a Brookville Reformed UCC in Long Island. Is a congregation that houses both. The building houses both a synagogue and a UCC a Reformed RCA UCC congregation, as well as a Muslim organization, and they're actually going to be featured as one of the stories in a documentary called All of Us, which is going to be released on May 16th. And through the UCC, we're going to be putting some more information about that. And it's the documentary is about examples of where people from across cultural or faith differences are coming together to be together, to live together, to work together. And so we actually have a congregation that's featured in that documentary.
That is very near me. I'm in Garden City, Long Island. So
Okay.
Brookville is about a few towns away.
Great.
There's another place here in Manhattan it's called the House of One. House of One is actually an Islamic group, and they are actually worshiping and doing program in a synagogue, because they were actually looking for space around 2010, and they couldn't find a place. So the lady who's leading the group actually went to the rabbi, and she said, if I could not get it, that's all right. But what happened was the rabbi said yes. And so now they have programs going on. And even if there are 2 religions, they're also overlapping in their fellowship. So this is a good place to see. Again, it is in Manhattan. It is around the Chelsea area. So, and the name of the place is Cordova House.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you everyone so much for participating in these calls. And again, if you are watching this recording later, feel free to email me or Mark. Mark is PettisM, I'm guessing, at ucc.org, at PettisM at ucc.org. And of course, I'm Hassan I. And we'll see you next week for racism in the refugee resettlement system and what that means contextually for Muslims. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.